British rock, you know, Cream, Hendrix to a degree, although he was not obviously English, and then, you know, the way that the Stones and Zeppelin developed and progressed over the ensuing years.
The Band of Joy had by now made a full commitment to these early strains of hard rock, with Plant taking his inspiration from both California and the new, tougher blues bands. The group's brand of psychedelic blues rock had attracted a sizable following to their live performances. Intriguingly, Band of Joy perhaps demonstrated that Robert Plant was engaged in the musical developments that prefigured Led Zeppelin, some time before he encountered Jimmy Page. For his part, Page was traveling a similar path through the changes in 60s rock, as lead guitarist with the Yardbirds.
Well, the Yardbirds are interesting because, in a way, within one group, you can track the progression of 60s British pop music, or certainly aspects of it, in that, you know, they move from this R&B blues band into a much more chart-oriented pop band. And then they react again to the sort of spirit of 67 and psychedelic rock and everything getting a bit heavier, and so they come out the other side of being a pop band into a band that starts to point the way towards you know, heavy rock, progressive rock, whatever term you want to use to describe the kind of music that emerges in the late 60s. So to an extent, you know, you can see Led Zeppelin as the next logical step after that.
The Yardbirds had first broken out of the R&B frame in 1965 with the massive hit For Your Love, and though Eric Clapton had resigned in protest at the change of direction, the band remained a clearinghouse for several of the era's greatest guitarists. As the group's work moved further toward the left field, their sound was expanded by the virtuoso playing of both Jeff Beck and, eventually, Jimmy Page.
Well, once we were able to move away from a strict formula, then the world is your lobster, or whatever they say. So once we'd had that hit, and it was so different, but still accepted by our club audiences, by our rude audience, it meant that we could be very experimental. So we then did start to write, and write crazy stuff, and do all sorts of weird stuff, you know, and it just carried on from there, you know, this continual experimentation. We were very much a club band, and you had to play long sets in those days. So we would start to improvise, stretch out. Of course, the blues is great to stretch out on. There's no set pattern to it. There is the 12 bar, the turnaround or whatever. But we started to introduce time changes, elongated passages, moments of great power brought right down to nothing from a crescendo. You know, all to do with not only sort of, you know, getting the energy out of ourselves, but dealing with the time we had to play and also the audience. By that time, we'd gone quite psychedelic, and Jimmy, you know, he brought his wah-wah pedal into it and that strange, sort of rather menacing sound that he had.
You can certainly see a lot of what begins to emerge on the first Led Zeppelin album as a logical progression from what the Yardbirds were doing at the end of their existence.
So long, darling. Oh, how I hate to see you go.
By 1968, the Band of Joy, frustrated by the lack of a record contract, had dissolved, and Robert had returned to his blues roots, performing vocals for Alexis Corner. In the summer of the same year, the Yardbirds split, leaving Chris Dreyer and Jimmy Page as the only remaining members. Eager to find a frontman and relaunch the band as the new Yardbirds, Page approached rock vocalist Terry Reid, who declined the gig but recommended Plant. Page, Dreyer and erstwhile manager Peter Grant travelled to a small venue in Birmingham to watch Plant turn out with his new ersatz psychedelia group, Hobbs Tweedle.
I remember it as being something like some sort of like a school somewhere. I don't remember there being any sort of, funnily enough, this is my memory, but I think there was a sort of a question mark over Robert, you know, funnily enough. He was a bit of a screamer.
Robert Plant was by no means the first choice as Led Zeppelin's vocalist, or the new Yardbirds vocalist as it was initially conceived. What they'd seen of him singing with Hobbs Tweedle had far from convinced them. From there, Page and Plant have a bonding session at Page's house on the River Thames, where Plant is invited to bring some of his favourite records along. And I've heard the story from both of them, and you know, they sat there over a pile of records and found this empathy, a shared love for many of the same records. You know, even if I don't think Page quite went along with sort of Moby Grape and Jefferson Airplane, but there were enough common points for them there to realise that they could work together.
With a disinterested Dreyer having fallen out of the equation, Page dropped the new Yardbirds working title and sought to build a new group from the ground up. Alongside Plant, drummer John Bonham and bassist John Paul Jones, he looked to develop a sound that would represent a leap forward from contemporary blues rock, a project evolved under the name of Led Zeppelin.
He had this notion of a new kind of dynamics within the sound that combined passages of huge fury, really, sonic fury and noise, and then a much gentler, softer sound, and putting the two together to create a really dynamic contrast. And you know, you hear that perhaps most acutely on the first album on Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You.
Oh, I can hear it calling me back home.
This fantastic electric blues rock number, and yet within it you also have these quite gentle passages. What made them special and unique, if you like, was the combination, the dynamic combination of the sound.
Though Plant's vocal range and blues sensibility was well suited to Page's dynamics, the early days of Zeppelin cast him very much in the role of a support act to the more experienced guitarist. But as frontman to a band of steadily rising renown, Plant's personality gradually began to impose itself on the group's identity.
Initially, it was perhaps difficult to see why Led Zeppelin alighted on Robert Plant. His position in the band was not secure. Even after the release of the first album, there was talk of ousting him because people weren't convinced that he was the right man. What he brought was not simply the voice, but an innate empathy and understanding for all kinds of different musics and how they could be synthesized into something new, whether it was blues, whether it was folk, whether it was the sort of psychedelic rock influence. And of course, he becomes a very fine songwriter. And the Page Plant songwriting team eventually explodes into something quite special. But, looking back, this was Jimmy Page's band, and Plant's position was quite insecure, and it took him some time